Dan Poblocki. You are listening to Our First Fears, a podcast about gateway horror, past and present, with creators currently working in the genre. On today's episode, I'm joined by artist, illustrator, and writer Trevor Henderson, whose debut middle grade novel, Scarewaves, hits shelves next week. It's a very scary tale, peppered with Trevor's trademark monsters that have turned him and his work into viral sensations. Have you heard of Siren Head, Cartoon Cat, Long Horse? If not, most likely your children have, and they're probably sharing stories about them on the recess playground at school and giving each other nightmares, as I surely would have done if I'd been lucky enough to encounter them when I was a kid. These creatures are Trevor's inventions, and in our chat, we talk about where they came from and how Trevor created them. Trevor suggested that we also chat about the VHS horror covers from our childhood video rental stores. We talk about visual artwork that burrows into young brains, about movie taglines that are as intriguing as they are hilarious, about why horror films in the 1980s were obsessed with the human body and, in particular, the many ways in which it can melt. Trevor shares stories about how nostalgia can birth a lifelong love for a genre. We get into how certain young readers need their scary stories completely unboiled down, and also the power and influence and beauty of a school book fair. Finally, we get into some gritty details about Trevor's book, Scarewaves, and what he's planning next. This is definitely a chat between two hardcore horror fans. Hopefully, for some hardcore horror fans to listen to. But also, even if you like your horror on the cozy side, I'll bet there's some great stuff in here for you too. What I enjoy most about this conversation is the talk about creativity, writing for kids, and how we've both approached it. Now, turn down the lights, turn up the volume, and get ready to explore our first fears. Hi, Trevor. Thanks so much for coming on and talking to me about our first fears.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I've been looking forward to this.
Yeah, no, how are you doing? How's everything going?
Oh my God, it's been so busy. It's been like the busiest, but in a good way, the busiest summer in memory. Me and my partner Jen Woodall went on a bunch of trips. Last trip we went to California. We were in San Francisco briefly because she had an art show that was opening there. She's also a comic artist, so I came along
Cool.
for the ride. Yeah. We went to Texas. I was in Texas in San Antonio for the Ghoulish Book Festival.
That's right.
Way
That's right.
back.
You mentioned that. Yeah.
Which was super fun. We went to Vancouver briefly. So a lot of different stuff. I'm really exhausted. And now I'm in the middle of TIFF Midnight Madness. So I'm like working every day and then going to a movie at midnight for 10 days.
You're so lucky that you get to be able to do that.
Yeah, no, Toronto has an amazing film scene, and I look forward to Midnight Madness specifically every year, every September. But like all the good stuff is like starting today and moving forward. So I'm really
Is it all new films they're showing?
Oh yeah, it's like world premiere movies that haven't been seen anywhere. Yesterday we saw a movie from Saudi Arabia called Naga that was incredible, which is like this incredibly anxious comedy about a woman who gets stranded in the desert and has to try and get home, and all this stuff starts happening like after hours, and involves a rabid camel attacking her at one point. It briefly becomes it briefly becomes a like an animal attack horror movie where she's trapped under a car and this rabid camel is trying to eat her, and it's like actually very scary. I don't like camels.
I think, when I started seeing these images of camels kind of like vomiting up some kind of organ and letting it dangle outside of their mouth to cool off and then like being able to like pull that back in, I was like, these things have secrets.
I forgot that they could do that. That's extremely weird. Like, you know what you're getting with a apex predator like a bear or a cougar or whatever. But then you get these like prey animals like deer and like camels and
deer.
That do all kinds of weird stuff. Like the deer that, the shedding and the constant bleeding. There's a kind of deer I was reading about that just will start bleeding from an orifice on its head and nobody knows why it does it. It's crazy. It's great.
Well, that is fascinating. First of all, because I finished reading your book, which was so
Oh yeah.
great, and
Oh,
the
thank you so
all of
much.
it,
That
of
means so
course,
much.
the deer stuff in there. I'm like, what is this?
The deer stuff was the
Where is
first
this
thing that came
coming
to me.
from? Yes, it
Yeah.
seems very clear that there's some kind of fascination there, and I think that's cool.
Yeah. Small town kids versus monsters kind of thing. And the first thing I was like, weird deer, without spoiling too much. Um,
So you are here to talk about VHS horror art, and
yeah.
specifically a few images that you sent me, and I sent you a few back. We can go through those and dig in. First, would you mind telling the listeners, tell us who you are, what kind of work you do, and maybe your relationship to the horror genre?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, my name is Trevor Henderson. I'm a horror illustrator and creature concept designer, and trying to get more into writing. I do a lot of like flash fiction stuff, and I'm trying to like. I wrote a middle grade kids horror book for Scholastic that we'll talk about, I'm sure, later.
Yeah.
But mostly I do like horror illustration work, and I'm kind of best known, I guess, for doing these weird like photo bash illustrations with kind of spooky, what the kids call liminal photos, I guess,
Mm-hmm.
and then painting monsters into those images. And that kind of has become my what I'm known for, I guess. Certain characters that have popped up from that, like Siren Head and Cartoon Cat and Long Horse and all that.
Yes,
Yeah,
I can't wait to ask you about all these things.
yeah, please
It's
do.
it's really that's sort of how I came to find you, I guess, on the internet and
Yeah.
Twitter especially. But yeah, your stuff is really unique, and I have some thoughts I'd like to share a little bit later,
Oh,
and questions for sure. But the first question I'm asking all of my guests is, do you remember the first time you ever felt frightened?
yeah, well, I can't, it's so unreliable. I can't say it's the first time I've ever been frightened, but I distinctly remember, and this is like tangentially connected to the topic of like VHS horror and poster art. But the first time I was ever scared, or I can remember being really scared, was, well, let me see. There's a couple. The first one was watching a '70s film, really, really, really young, called Black Christmas.
Oh,
Um,
love that movie.
it's one of the best horror movies ever made, and
Yeah.
it's still so scary. But I remember watching that as a really young kid with my parents, and then going to bed and like having a weird like fever dream, half asleep thing of seeing like the crack in the door with the eyeball that happens in Black Christmas, but like just happening on my wall in the dark, and having awful nightmares about that. And then I think the other one that is kind of like hand in hand with that and very formative, that I'm sure you've already covered, I know for a fact you've already covered on this podcast, is The Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark Illustrations
Yes.
by Stephen Gamel.
Yes.
Specifically, there's one, the story's pretty tame. It's about like a priest dealing with a ghost in a haunted house. But the illustration is just this full frontal face of this desiccated woman with empty eye sockets.
Yep.
And I couldn't even look at it. I couldn't even, it was a mimetic hazard to me. I couldn't even engage
Ah,
with it. I was so
that's
scared of it.
that is incredible, especially because having seen so much of your work,
Oh
the,
yeah,
the digital stuff and the found footage stuff that you do, it's very twisted face based,
it
and
is. Yeah, the
yeah.
specter of that one image, I think, hangs over the last like 30 years of my life, more or
Mm.
less. I have a jacket with just with that blown up, that specific image on the back of it that my partner Jen made me, that I wear out because it's just like so emblematic, I think.
Isn't it funny how this thing that scared you so badly as a kid has
Yeah,
become this thing that you've embraced, that you clearly have a fondness for and appreciation for? Why does that happen? How does that
well,
happen?
that image like obviously has power, like such power for me and probably a ton of other people. And then just as I've grown, that power has been like recontextualized,
Yeah.
um, as something that scared me and still freaks me out a little bit, but more so is just like represents a certain time and place and like comfort and nostalgia in the same way that a lot of horror movies and horror culture in general does for me, because it's so tied up with being young and seeing this stuff for the first time and having such a visceral reaction to it. Yeah, and also like I was turned on to horror from my dad, who still loves horror, So, it's a really comforting genre for me because it's tied up with that nostalgia of being a little kid and
Yeah.
bonding with my dad and doing stuff with my dad.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. We've been chatting on Twitter, and you had decided that the VHS horror art would be a good topic to sort of get into as something that scared you when you were a kid. You said that there were certain images that freaked you the heck out. And you sent me some of them, and I'm just going to read them off for listeners because I'll probably post these images on my Instagram or on Twitter or wherever. So the complete list: Street Trash from 1987, directed
Yep.
by Muro; Fright Night from 1985, directed by Holland; Zombie, 1979, directed by Fulci; Suspiria, 77, directed by Argento. And then I sent you back The Stuff by Cohen from 1985, Alligator, 1980, directed by Teague; and The Gate from 1987, directed by Takash, I think is how you pronounce it. So yeah, so these are the ones that, I mean, I went through and rewatched all of them. I kind of had my own
Okay.
movie marathon because I hadn't seen some of them. Like I'd never actually seen.
I'm
Um,
sorry that I made you watch Street
oh
Trash. I'm
my
sorry.
God. Well, you know, I appreciate the apology, but I'm really glad I
Yeah.
saw it because
Okay, I'm good. I'm glad.
it's out of control. It is
It's
really like
oh my god.
and it sort of goes along with the image that you sent to me of the poster art being so bonkers. Like
Yeah,
one of the craziest images I've ever seen on a movie
it's
poster in
incredible.
my
Yeah.
life, and the movie lives up to it. And I
Yep.
don't like that. That alone is a remarkable thing. The film
Yeah.
itself is hard to watch because it is filled with assault, it is filled with racism, it is filled with,
Yeah.
and I think the director or the writer actually said something like, I am trying to offend every single person who lives on this planet with this script. So this is
Yeah.
what you're getting. And congratulations, man, you did it. He really did
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
So
I am
yeah.
aware that stuff is in there. I'm just obsessed with the weird
Oh yeah.
melty scenes. I was obsessed with that as a kid, and I think that was probably like I want to say that I didn't. I just watched those scenes because I was like fixated on them.
Yeah.
If anyone has not seen this movie, it is very much an exploitation film, punctuated by death scenes where people drink this weird liquor that they found in the wall of an old liquor store, and just like turn into like paint goop and melt and explode and inflate and pop and do all these various very fun body horror things. And the poster reflects that, and that it's a neon image of a man melting down a toilet, which really tells you everything you need to know about the movie in one go, I think.
Yeah, it really does. The image is sort of shot from above. This man is melting as he's pulling on a chain above his head to flush the toilet. Basically, he's flushing himself down the toilet.
Yeah,
I was shocked when I watched the movie that
that happens.
this actually happens. And
Yeah, no, that's not a
it
lie. Yeah,
looks exactly like this. And
yeah,
there is a kind of subgenre, I think, that is covered in a lot of the films that I just mentioned. I believe it's actually a subgenre. It's called melt movies.
melt movies. Yep, yep. You got your body melt. You got your street trash. You got the Blob '88, one of the best
Oh
movies
my
ever made.
God. I love the Blob 88.
Oh, it's perfect. Yeah.
But even in Fright Night, there is a melt
Yes.
scene. I mean, clearly this stuff is all about melting. The Gate,
Yep.
I want to say, maybe. I feel like there's a little bit of melting in all of these films that I just mentioned. I also want to mention the artists' names, the ones that
Yeah.
I find for these particular images. Street Trash was done by Barry E. Jackson, who also did, I believe, the Alligator poster art. Fright Night was Peter Mueller. Zombie was it's a film still from the actual film. The Stuff was done, the one that there's a couple different versions of the cover art for The Stuff, and the one that I chose was
The best one.
Drew Struzan, who's very
God,
well known
Thing.
for Indiana Jones and Star Wars work and a
The
lot of
Thing.
those. Yeah, oh, and The Thing, incredible. And then
Yeah,
I couldn't find an artist for the Gate and the Suspiria box, the one that you sent to me.
that's such a strange
It's
one.
such a strange one. I couldn't find the artist for that one either.
Yeah,
But that one definitely was a video production, like a VHS production that was put
yeah,
together probably by the VHS studio. So anyway, I wanted to give credit where credit is due. So these films and others, like we can talk about anything that you want to talk about, if it's something
yeah.
you didn't send to me already or what. But for our listeners, do you want to describe, we've already gone through Street Trash, but do you want to describe the ones that you sent to me? Maybe what is Fright Night?
Yeah.
Can you describe what the cover looks
Well,
like?
it's funny. I was wondering why these ones freaked me out, so much as a kid specifically, because they were the ones that came to the top of my head when you asked.
Yeah.
And they're all engaging with the viewer. They're all faces making eye contact, more or less. Fright Night is, it's one of the best horror posters of all time. It's beautiful. It's this beautifully painted suburban home at night, with somebody in the window, like a silhouette in the window, and then above it are just these gorgeous, beautiful, like gray and blue clouds forming into demonic faces and demonic hounds, with the image of the character Amy from the film in her vampire mode from the end of the film, where her mouth gets really wide and this giant horrible grin full of teeth. So yeah, and it's just staring dead ahead at the audience. The zombie poster is this very classic, iconic still of, I believe, Sergio Stivoletti's makeup job on like the coolest
Oh,
zombie in the movie. And I think he's called Worm Eye unofficially.
yeah.
Which is this rotten, dirt encrusted corpse with gnarly teeth and just a pile of worms like crawling out of his left eye socket
Like
or right eye
real
socket.
worms, like
Real worms,
live
yeah.
worms.
Yeah. They used to call those, in those Italian horror productions, flower pot zombies,
Oh,
I think, because they literally were just covered in pot like dirt and worms and earth, which is something I think that they should bring back with zombies. I'm tired of a couple contact lenses, a little bit of blood, and they'll sprint at you. I want to see like falling apart, like barely able to move, crawling out of the ground, like
yeah.
should not be able to function zombies, just encrusted in bugs and filth. That's the good stuff. But anyway, I digress. Street Trash is also, I think, someone, make like the guy melting is maybe less making eye contact, but it's just that one blew my mind as a kid, because it's like you can put that on a poster,
Yeah.
like that can be a thing that's on a movie
It
poster.
feels wrong.
It feels wrong, yeah. And specifically for a zombie, I remember, I have a distinct memory of seeing it in a video store with my dad when he told me to, pick stuff out to rent. When I was a kid and into my teenage years in Oshawa, which is a small town outside of Toronto, Canada, we had this mom and pop video store called Video Whiz. And I would always walk over there because they had a deal. And I would do this a lot of weekends because I was a weird kid who watched a lot of horror movies at the weekends, where you could pay $5 and get 5 movies for 5 days. It's their triple five deal.
Sweet.
So you'd always go, that's great. Yeah. And I always pick them up. And I remember going with my dad when I was really, really young, like 9 or 10, 11, like really young, and being so scared of that cover for Zombie, not only because of the face on it, but because this one said, like, it had like all these like warnings on it, like, warning, you may need a barf bag for this film, and like just all these like psych out, like hype up the film, like slogans on it. And I'm like, I don't know if I do want to engage with that. Like,
Yeah.
it actually did feel like something dangerous and weird that I was actually like a taboo to watch.
Yeah.
And then, of course, I did eventually watch it and love it. And there's literally a giant frame poster above me right now of Zombie, of that image.
That is
so.
That is crazy. I mean, I'm gonna please continue on, but I just wanted to interject with saying that I'm looking at it on my iPad on my desk right now, and remembering seeing that in the video store when I was a little kid, and just it was not okay for me. Like that was one I was definitely not. I didn't want. I was like, I'm not participating in that one.
Yeah,
no.
it feels like some. It feels like some wild shit's gonna happen in that movie. And to be fair to the poster, it does. It does.
Just
in
like
that movie.
just like Street Trash, it does live up to the movie. Does live up to this image, and I think that's a really hard thing to do. I think all of the ones that we sort of brought up live up to what the filmmakers were selling.
Absolutely. Alligator, you get exactly what that poster promises you. Alligator is awesome and great, and everyone should watch it.
Oh my God. Alligator. Alligator was one that I sent to you, and that was one that I'd never seen. So
Oh,
I
okay,
just
yeah,
recently watched that. And the reason I'd never seen it was because of this poster. It scared me so bad as a kid. And
yeah,
to be honest with you, when I was looking for it online, I think it's streaming on Shutter. And I called up or asked several friends to come over and watch this with me because I was just nervous about it.
yeah.
I'd seen clips about it. I knew it was a B horror movie, but there's something about the underwater shots. I have a fear of, I don't know what the phobia must be called, but it's a fear of mouths, sharp teeth,
Oh,
open maws, that kind of thing. And the way that the
yeah,
alligator in the poster is sort of lurking out of the darkness underneath this sort of
yeah. It's like
arched
under an
sewer.
arch, sewer arch. Yes, exactly.
It's
Yeah, it's
very
really
shadowy.
ominous.
It's
Yeah,
ominous. You can barely see the alligator's eyes, but its mouth is open in that sort of creepy alligator way that they do when they're
yeah.
resting. And I was freaked out. I couldn't get anybody to come and watch it with me, so I stuck it out by myself. But it freaked me out.
There's one scene in the movie that's still like a lot of that movie is more like action horror,
Yeah.
like animal attack kind of stuff. But there's one scene with a kid at night that
Oh
feels like
my God.
it's just torn from an actual like childhood fear or nightmare
Yes.
of something in a body of water where it's like this kid goes out in the middle of the night to a swimming pool and he's covering his eyes and he's going to jump in and doesn't realize there's this
His
giant
brother
alligator.
his brothers
Yeah.
are teasing him and saying we're gonna wait, make you walk the plank, and he
It's
looks
just, oh my
down.
God.
He's able to look down into the pool, see this giant monstrous alligator. Just at the last second, it's too late. He goes into the pool and the pool fills with
Oh,
blood, and forget it.
I, I, I couldn't remember if they teased that and then pulled back at the
No.
last second, but no.
No, he goes in and he gets
You,
jumped.
you got to respect that. I mean, they
Yeah.
don't. That's rare in the '80s.
Yeah.
They shied away from that stuff a little bit, but the only yeah, I guess even the stuff, all those movies we talked about really do deliver on their posters. I could have done with more melting in the stuff personally,
Yeah.
but it's
Fair.
still pretty much there.
This
Yeah,
stuff is more about you getting cleaned out from the inside than about
yeah,
your skin melting from the outside, right?
yeah. It's about pudding eating you, hollowing you out.
Yes.
Yeah,
So it goes
yeah,
in, cleans you out,
yeah,
turns you into a pod person for as long as it needs, and then it moves on.
yeah.
But that post,
There's some great stuff with like heads getting like knocked off and it's just full of
oh
ash
yeah,
because the stuff is just
it's
eating
just
you. Yeah,
eating
it's
you.
great.
But the poster itself, the one by Drew Struzan,
It's amazing.
is the one that I remember from the VHS cover. It's the image of a kitchen at night with a refrigerator door open a crack, light streaming out, and this white ooze that is pouring out of the refrigerator, and these melting people sort of reaching up with their arms extended, with their jaws overly extended, and it's not
Yeah.
anything that happens in the film, but as an image
God, I
to
wish it did.
sell this
Yeah.
movie, I think it's very, very effective. And it's just
Oh, absolutely.
it's got this kind of 80s illustrative quality to it, like those Star
Yeah.
Wars movies, the Indiana Jones movies, The Thing. It's clearly a painting.
Yeah. It's a lost, not really a lost art, but it's definitely not in favor these days. And whenever I see it pop up for a newer horror movie, then it's really great to see, first of all, just from, people are still practicing the art of that movie poster, like the really nice painted movie poster, especially for horror films, but it also sells a very specific vibe. There's a movie I'm actually seeing tonight at Midnight Madness called When Evil Lurks,
That's at the
which is
Toronto Film Festival.
yeah, the Toronto International Film Festival, and it's a follow up to this really great movie called Terrified that came out a while back from the same
Terrified
director.
is one of the scariest movies I've seen in the past 10 years.
Oh my god, it's so
Do
good and so
people know
scary,
do
and
people know about this movie?
I hope so. I mean, it's on Shutter. You can go watch it right now. It's kind of like if Poltergeist was an entire neighborhood, and it kind of starts sort of in a pseudo anthology format where you're following different houses in this neighborhood as very scary things happen. Like there's monsters under the bed, but also like the scariest thing is this goddamn little kid that gets hit by a car, and then he comes home and it's just this corpse of a child that only moves when people aren't looking at him. It's horrible. But yeah, it's great, and everyone should go watch it. And the follow up film has a beautiful old school painted movie poster with this like farming landscape. And these people looking up in awe as this giant demonic hand like descends from the sky, and it's drawing this bloody line through the land, dividing everybody, and it's gorgeous. And the early reports are saying it's very much like a paperback horror novel come to life, like that very old school like vibe of horror films. So I'm really excited, and I'm glad that they sold it with that, you know, that nostalgic painted horror movie poster. I love seeing
that's
it.
a great idea. I don't feel like I've seen a lot of that recently, and one of the questions I was going to ask you a little bit later was if there's any modern artists or posters that are having the same kind of impact that these older images had on us. For a time, maybe 10, 15 years ago, it was all, I don't know, like no commentary on the artists or the designers who made these films, but like with some of the more like torture porny kind of things, they were just kind of generic, like, oh, everything's rusty, oh, everything's just photoshoppy, and
yeah, there was definitely some, like, you know, it was definitely a lot more photo based stuff, very sepia tone, like less, not so much the talking, like the big heads. That was more not really a horror film thing so much, but it definitely fell into a lot of samey characteristics, I guess, and kind of fell away from that. I guess it's seen as retro, like very 80s. And unless you're trying to like capture some aspect of that vibe, then people don't want to give that impression, maybe, or shy away from giving that impression so much. So maybe I'd love to see it come back into vogue a little more. The whole alternative movie poster culture is still thriving and has been thriving for years, you know, Mondo and everything. But I'd love to see like that embraced again by like the studios for actual horror films. Like Talk to Me should have had a great old school painted poster. That would have been cool.
Yeah, I'm trying to picture the poster for that in my head, and I can't.
It's a photo. It's just the beautiful, that iconic hand from Talk to Me. It's just like a photo of it. But I can already see like the beautifully rendered like painted version of that. That could be cool.
Oh yeah. Okay, cool. So I mean, maybe we can get back to that in a little bit, but there's two more images I want to sort of describe to the listeners, and one of them you picked, and it's a strange one because it freaked you. Say it freaked you out, but it's not necessarily something that would that I think a lot of people would say like, oh my god, that's so scary. And it's the Suspiria VHS box art. Can you sort of describe what we're looking at here?
Yeah. It's always stuck with me because it's not what I would think to market Suspiria, which is a very like lurid, brightly colored, very like surreal, not surreal, but definitely a very colorful film that rides on vibes. And the poster for the VHS cover, which I've never, or the cover for the VHS release, the American one, is an image I've never seen in relation to the film anywhere else. It's only ever been on this one release, I think. And it's the main character kind of sitting in a mirror in like a dressing room at this ballet academy. And it's all browns and greens and golds. It's very like classical, like almost sepia tone. She's brushing her hair, and in the doorway is open a crack behind her in the mirror, and there's like a weird kind of ghostly mist coming through, and then you can see the feet of somebody hung through the doorway, and then it's got this really embellished border as well, like painted around it, of like statuary, I think, and vines and like gargoyles, I think. And it's just such a weird, mysterious image that it completely like enthralled me when I had no idea what the film was and I'd never seen it. And it's just a really strange image, and it's always grabbed me. And in a way that's as immediate as the ones that are like just a big gross face, but for like completely different reasons. And I have no idea specifically why, but it really creeped me out. I don't know what about it specifically. It really got me.
It's an unconscious thing, maybe. It's something that you can't even explain, and I appreciate that. I think that's kind of a cool way to sort of say it. There's something uncanny about it, and oftentimes we can't explain.
It definitely feels like it's implying a lot and not showing you some really horrible things that are just like hinted at in a way that the movie does. The movie full on will show you. Yes, very much.
It's kind of incongruous to what is in the film. It doesn't match up with the color palette that Argento was using. It does, like the stone statuary imagery around the border of Jessica Harper's face. It is not in the film at all. But
Yeah.
again, it's a way that these production companies were trying to sell films to us.
Yeah.
And I mean, something that we haven't really mentioned yet is a little bit. You talked about how Zombie was like, you're going to need a barf bag for this, but
Yeah. Yeah.
these images also come with taglines. Some of them are kind of cool, but the tagline on the Suspiria box is, "The only thing more
Yeah.
terrifying than the last 10 minutes of this film are the first 90." And like,
Which,
what
like, that sounds, sorry, yeah, it sounds amazing until you actually sit down and think about it. And then what you're saying is that, like, your movie starts really strong and then kind of like isn't as good, isn't as scary as it goes on. But it sounds really like, oh man, wow. It's like,
Yeah,
yeah.
I think probably what they were going for was that, like, the first 90 or the last 10 minutes are
Yeah.
so scary that the
Yeah.
first 90 are going to like go to 11. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
the Fright Night poster has a couple of taglines I thought were kind of cool. "There are some very good reasons to be afraid of the dark." And
Yeah.
also, "If you love being scared, it'll be the night of your life."
That's a very creep show core
Yeah, yeah.
tagline, like very like the most fun you'll have being scared.
Of course, The Stuff has an amazing tagline. The Stuff is a commentary on modern culture,
Yeah.
American culture in particular. The tagline is, "Are you eating it, or is it eating you?" And I guess
Yeah.
the answer could be a little of both.
Yes.
Alligator's tagline is, "It lives 50 feet beneath the city. It's 36 feet long. It weighs 2,000 pounds. And it's about to break out."
That's it. See, how can you not want to watch that?
Exactly.
I love horror movie taglines where they just like list stats and you're like,
Yes.
whoa. Like Scanners has a really good one where it's like, 10 seconds you get a headache, 40 seconds your brain starts to boil, 90 seconds you explode. I'm like, okay, I say, heck yeah, hell yeah, sign me up, sure.
I love it. It's marketing. I am
Yeah,
not a marketing person. So I don't know, like, I don't come up with taglines, but I always love
yeah,
for my books when Scholastic especially is very good at coming up with taglines. I can't remember the ones for my own books, but there's one on yours for Scarewaves.
yes.
"This town is old. Its secrets are older."
Which they fully just, yeah, they I was like, that sounds great, yeah,
Yeah.
sure.
It's a skill that is kind of remarkable, because we
Oh
are
yeah,
we
it's
are
a very,
trying to sell the thing to an audience,
yeah.
and yeah, it's not something that I know how to do.
It's funny that I was trying so hard to find a title for Scarewaves, and I was giving them big lists of various titles that were maybe close to it, and they all were dancing around specifically. It was all like, scary airwaves and Rod and Air, and then like it's Scarewaves, dude. Clearly it's Scarewaves. How did you not? I'm like, oh yeah, that's great.
It's incredible.
It's just like a skill set I don't
Yeah,
have as
yeah.
well as some people at
I mean, it's
Scholastic.
a very clever title, and it works perfectly.
It is. It's so good. It fits perfectly, and I wish I'd thought of it myself.
The last movie poster that I sent to you was The Gate.
Oh, that's such a
It's
good
it's a good
one.
one. It scared me when I was a kid. I mean, I came out in '87, so I was 10, and right at the beginning of my like
That's
immediate
perfect.
passion for the John Bellairs
Yeah,
books. Just starting to get into ghost stories, and this
yeah,
movie, for the longest time, I thought The Gate was rated R. Only
yeah.
within
It
the
doesn't pull a lot
past
of punches.
in the past year, I looked it up and I was like, no, it's rated PG-13, and it always has been. And I don't know why I had
Yeah,
that like wrong in my head, but probably because of what is in the
it's
film.
scary. Yeah,
The image itself is the title, The Gate, rendered to sort of look like a giant hole in the ground, where
yeah,
there's two red beady eyes down deep inside the hole, and a couple of monstrous demon hands reaching out and trying to pull itself up. The tagline for this one is, "There's a passageway, a gate, behind which the demons wait to take back what once was theirs. Dot dot dot. Pray it's not too late."
I've seen a version where it's just a little bit shorter, where it just says they have opened the gate. pray it's not
There you
gateway,
go.
which is also really
Yeah.
frustrating. That's good.
Yeah. The succinctness, I think, works better.
Yeah, that's an incredible gateway horror film. If you haven't seen The Gate, like
Yes.
it's for kids in that it has kid characters that are I feel really well written. It's very like the plot is pretty simple, but it doesn't talk down to a younger audience. It's very scary on its own terms, and it's just loaded with all kinds of weird set pieces. Like there's great little monsters running around, like little guys, which is a subgenre I personally really love. There's doppelganger parents whose heads melt, and
Melt movie.
it's really it's another melt movie. That's the 80s horror genre is specifically very concerned with the flesh.
Yes.
Everything is about like body horror and just your physical form deteriorating in various ways. Not even just being murdered by some guy in a Halloween mask, but like very much the body horror genre lives in the 80s.
Yeah.
Aside from a few, exceptions.
I would love to figure out what that is all about, but it might be a longer conversation.
Yeah.
about bodies melting in the 80s, because basically what the ones that we've listed here span 10 years, 77 to 87.
Yeah.
And a lot of them are melt movies, and the one that you mentioned earlier, Blob 1988, is like one of the best body horror, humans melting.
Oh yeah.
Like out of control. I love it so much.
It's ridiculous. My most controversial horror opinion that I drop sometimes is that I think that the Blob 88 has better effects work than The Thing.
I think
it does. I think that,
and that's a huge argument to make.
Huge bar. Yeah, I think that The Thing is more ambitious in terms of what they're trying to do and pulling off all these crazy things they've never seen before. But the Blob was very centered on like it's people melting, but they do it's so well done and it's so effective. And there's shots in that movie that I have no idea to this day how they pulled it off or did it. It's really good.
The thing that sticks out to me about that movie is the viscosity, the texture of the blob itself. It almost looks like the underside of like somebody's tongue, that like kind of veiny pink kind of like, it's really grody, but there's something, there's like a muscle in there that's moving and it's able to do the horrible things that it does.
To flex, yeah. Another detail of that movie I really love is that when the movie starts, the blob is like this purple, almost like pale white kind of quality color. And then the more people it eats, the redder it gets as the movie goes on, that was really nice and subtle. It's like cool. Absorbing all the blood. Yeah, right?
Yeah, that's something cool. That you as an artist are probably more tuned into than I'm able to. But like, what a great detail! Like that's a specific choice.
And it's never pointed out. It's obviously just like a internal like special effects Bible quality that they adhered to as the film went on, with different stages of the blob as it got bigger, until at the end it's like basically crimson. Yeah. But yeah, I always say that movie and Tremors are the two perfect like blueprint monster movies of all time. Like 10 out of 10, nothing wrong with either of them. I think they both share the quality of having one shot in the whole movie that kind of doesn't look 100% perfect of the monster, but otherwise it's like seamless. Like the graboids and Tremors are just like, that's a special effects achievement I've never seen since.
Tremors also on my list, gateway horror. Oh yeah, mind-blowing. I mean, the whole sort of tagline for Jaws from whatever it was 10, 12 years prior to Tremors was, what was it? Safe to go back?
It was another one of those
in the water or something like that. And then the whole Tremors.
Just when you thought
it was safe to go back in the water. And then Tremors sort of takes that idea and says, no, you can't. You're not going to be safe on land. You can't even step on the ground.
Yeah.
Watch out.
I think the tagline for Tremors is just when you thought there was nothing new under the sun, but under the ground.
That's great. And it's
really good. Yeah.
So there is kind of a tie to the Jaws tagline there, just when you thought.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's interesting.
It's not a tagline on the poster, but I've always been obsessed with the first trailer for Jaws because there's a narration with a deep like movie voice guy going like, just listing facts about the shark. It's like 20 feet long, and it's almost as if God made the devil and gave him Jaws. It's just like the hardest line in film history. Like, holy shit, it's so
That's
good.
incredible.
But yeah, that was
And that was another, like I already told you, I have a fear of mouths and sharp teeth. So that poster in particular was another really, really intense find for me at my local video store when I was a kid.
Also, the poster for Jaws and Tremors are the exact same thing.
Oh my God, right.
Realizing, yeah,
they are. The marketing people knew what they were doing.
Clearly, yeah, exactly the same thing. Yeah.
So I want to find out what your video rental store origin story is. Like what do you remember about going into the horror section as a kid?
Okay, yeah, I can speak to this. Well, there were two places that I really liked when I was growing up. One was the one I mentioned earlier, Video Whiz in Oshawa, which was just like a great mom and pop place with a really good horror section of those, the VHS tapes in the big white boxes where they cut the cover and slip them into the big plastic things that were all chunky.
The chunky one.
Yeah. And I'd go there and get, five movies, $5, 5 days. It's perfect. And then, you go to the Little Caesars next door and you're set. But the fancy one, the really good one, was a place called Jumbo Video, which I think never breached Canada. I think that's a Canada-only franchise. And it had a big elephant mascot on the sign. But the good thing about Jumbo Video when you went was that they had free popcorn when you went in, and it was the saltiest popcorn known to mankind. It was incredible. I still have like taste sense memories of the popcorn from this rental store when I was.
But they just gave you a cup and you could fill it up and walk around the store.
There was like an old timey like carnival, like those glass cases filled with popcorn as you came in on wheels, and you could just fill it up as much as you want, whatever. Doesn't matter if you rented anything or not. And the other great thing about them, the best thing, was that all the sections of the store were normal, just shelves. But the horror section was at the back of the store, and it was through a couple swinging doors. So it was kept away. And the whole wall that the swinging doors were in was made up to look like a castle wall, paper mache castle wall, with turrets and like skulls and like all this. It looked like a haunted house from a carnival. So you'd have to, venture into it if you wanted to check out these covers. It felt forbidden. It was like the adult video section in some stores.
But also, I mean, the way that you're describing it, it sounds like, hey, kids, come into the fun house. You're not allowed, but you want to come in here.
Yeah. So you're already, if you're a little kid, you're already a little trepidatious, in the same way you might be about a haunted house in a carnival. And then you go in and it was just, the rows of horror movies on the shelves. But the outside was just like the fact that they went to the trouble of making this like castle stone wall. I'm sure it's a lot crazier in my head than it actually was, but I remember it being really impressive. And I did that all my early years were just like watching stuff with my dad that was not at all for that age group. He worked until the early morning unloading trucks in a warehouse. And then he'd come home at like 1 a.m, 2 a.m, and he'd wake me up on a school night. This is not something I advise for parents, but I treasure it now. And then we would sneak downstairs together in the basement where the TV was. And then we would watch like Return of the Living Dead or Army of Darkness, The Incredible Melting Man, all kinds of weird stuff. Not at all for kids. And then, if my mom woke up, I would hide and then until she went back to bed. So I got this stuff all really, really early. And the video stores were a big part of that.
That's very cool.
Yeah.
I think I probably would have lost my mind if my own video store had been set up like a castle. All right, my cat is trying to get up on my lap. Yeah, flipping out, knocking stuff over. That's great, and I think it's amazing that your dad allowed you to have those moments with him. Like that must feel special and kind of unique. And
very much
even having that kind of like, mom wouldn't let me do this or whatever,
Yeah, no, I mean that wasn't fair to her. She was completely in the right in terms of like not showing a 10 or 11-year-old like Return of the Living Dead, for instance.
That one in particular.
And that was one of the tamer ones. I distinctly remember watching like Cannibal Ferox with my dad at a young age, and that's some like heavy stuff. Wow. I think that one was in an effort to make me like not think I was such hot shit at watching horror movies, and I was fine with it, so it didn't work at all. But yeah, don't show your kids Cannibal Ferox, everybody. Please don't do this.
That's unbelievable.
Yeah, I know it's crazy. I don't advise it, but at the age of 37, I look back on it and I really
Mhm.
appreciate it. But it could have easily gone a different way. My mom was totally in the right about not showing kids really violent, horrible
Yeah.
movies. But it's the two things. I'm so happy that he did.
Yeah, it's funny, like talking about the things that maybe kids can't handle, shouldn't be watching, versus gateway
Yeah.
horror. It's I don't know. Is it a fine line or is it like a very distinct line?
I think it's a very distinct line, and I think it's also like it's so hard. I think it really depends on the kid as well, and I think the big thing for me was that my dad was there. If my dad wasn't there watching with me, this stuff would not have been okay in any way,
Okay.
shape, or form. But because he was there, it became like a very like comforting thing. It became like an activity I was sharing with my dad. I was sharing his interest, and it became my interest, and now it's tied up in all these like really nice memories of spending
Yeah.
time with my dad. And he was always there to be like, this is clearly a movie. We rented it. It's not any. It's all
Mhm.
puppets and stuff. And I read
Oh
Fangoria
yeah.
at the time, and which had always had like the featurettes on
How
like
they
how
did
they
it.
did this. I had there's two books that I recommend called Grand Illusions by Tom Savini, and he goes through all these great 80s horror movies like Creepshow, The Burning, Maniac, and he shows you exactly how they did everything with diagrams and like step by step by step, and it's wonderful. And that went a long way to also being like, this is an art. This is not anything really to be scared of, because it's something these professionals made
Yeah.
for fun, and it's a fantasy. You can. I feel like kids can deal with a lot if they're not talked down to, and if there's someone there to kind of like
Hmm.
support that, and also like establish that this is
Yeah.
make believe. It's a fiction. Yeah.
It's I never thought about the point you're making about the makeup effects. I was also drawn to Fangoria magazine when I was a little kid. The covers
Mm.
always showed, the most
Oh yeah.
gory monster faces, bloody effects, and then
Yeah.
you looked inside and you're like, oh wait, they're showing me how they pasted this onto this person's face. They're showing me how this is all
Yeah.
fake. And I never really thought about that until just now, that that was a way for me to contextualize what I was seeing, particularly on the pages of that magazine. And when I was able to get my hands on the videotapes to understand that the horror was behind a lens, behind there's a
Yeah.
separation there between this and reality. I have some other things that I wanted to mention, but I think this is kind of a good segue into talking about you and your work, particularly the monsters that you're making. I feel like there's an element to the images that you create that is inviting
Yeah.
the viewer to participate in a way, like in story making and the
Yeah.
story buildings, trying to figure out what is happening here. I know you mentioned earlier the box art being effective because the ones that we
Yeah.
mentioned like all sort of have eye contact, and that seems to be something that you do yourself in the images that you make, and that's why some of them, like most of them, are absolutely terrifying. There's a found footage aspect to
Yeah.
it. So I mean,
Yeah. I mean, I agree with you. I think all of that is
yeah,
wrapped up in there.
I guess I'm just wondering, is like, like this is probably going to be annoying to you because I hate this question. It's
No,
like
no, you're good.
how did you start? Where do your monsters come from? Like how did you start making
Yeah.
these things? And is there a connection to the box art from VHS era?
I'm sure. I feel like I said earlier, the specter of that one
Hmm.
Stephen Gamel illustration like looms over everything. But also, I'm sure it's tied to a lot of the box art I saw when I was younger. Like the digital painted stuff I do, it tends to be like that kind of imagery, like the big face. Whenever I'm, creatively blocked and I can't think of anything to draw, it usually ends up being a big, scary skeleton face or whatever staring directly at the viewer as kind of a reset, I guess. But the photo based stuff, I agree with you that I feel like there is. I think the reason that it hit so well and has been so successful and really, caught on in a weird way like 4 or 5 years ago when I started doing it, is that it does directly engage with an audience in that I try and make it just enough interest in both the image and the little caption that it doesn't tell you the whole story, but it is enough to hopefully hook you into like making up the rest of the context between those two things for what's going on in your head. So hopefully, when you see one that is particularly successful, then it's a combination of like a kind of an enigmatic image with like an enigmatic sentence or two, and then that you can put the narrative together and it's functionally like a whole story, but you're the author, you're the one who's using it as a jumping off point. When I was a kid, there was a book that I never actually read, but I was obsessed with the idea of, and the few illustrations I saw. The name escapes me right now. I can get it for you later, but it is a storybook that was designed to be specifically prompts for bigger stories in the classroom for kids to write
I
from.
think it's The Mysteries of Harris Burdick by Chris Van Allsburg. Yeah.
That's the one. That's absolutely the one. And like, the context of the story of the images is that, there's a note I think at the beginning from the publisher saying that like he dropped off all these illustrations, and then he went out to get the stories that go with them and disappeared off the face of the planet. So now all they're left with is these little like one sentence prompts and the imagery. And I love that idea, and I wanted to do a similar sort of thing with my art, but also incorporating found footage horror, which is something that I loved and still love. So it was kind of a combination of wanting to do a sort of updated version of that book through social media posts that'll kind of make people want to, even just internally tell their own story from this image. And also like, what if I could take like the big moment from a found footage horror movie, that the last hour and 10 has been building up to. They always have like, you'll watch an hour and 10 of the guy, like, playing with a camcorder as they go on like a road trip to a spooky house or whatever. And it always builds to like these 2 to 3 or 3 to 4 really amazing images that you couldn't get unless you'd spent that time with them and really been embroiled in the like kind of the aesthetic and the feel of the found footage, the camcorder thing. It's like, what if can I try and like lightning in a bottle that and just get that impression just from one image that's like a screenshot from a found cursed tape, and then just the barest context to kind of like root it in a story. And that's kind of what I try and do every time I do one of those.
When you are creating these, do they appear like hypnagogic hallucinations to you, or do you sit and think of that first hour worth of story before? No, you don't.
No. Nothing like that. Most of them, there'll be a little bit more context sometimes in my head after I've made them. For the most part, what you see is what there is, more or less. Some of the characters that pop up, like Siren Head, there's a little bit more explanation behind the scenes, I guess. But most of them are just like, I'll get a photo, which is usually like donated by someone, which also I think really helps with engaging, because it's like, not only is this the imagery and the scenes that I use like very like what's around your house, usually the people who are looking at it, like it's they can look out their window or look in a room, and it's the same sort of thing. But also the fact that people can like send in photos and then they can get chosen to be used for that. It's kind of like a process of involving the audience a little bit, I guess. But what was I saying? Sorry, I went off track.
I don't remember either, because I was fascinated with what you were saying. But I think it's kind of cool that you involve your audience, and I didn't realize that so many of them were actually sent in by people on where, like, how are these people finding you?
Oh, it's all through. This was more so nowadays. I just really either use ones I take myself, or I've purchased some photos for commercial use for various projects, so that I can like fully say like, oh, that's all locked up. But in the early days, like 4 or 5 years ago, it would be people on Twitter would just send me photos, and then I would credit their Twitter account underneath, be like, thank you for the base photo, this person's Twitter username. But I don't do that anymore, and haven't for a while, just because it's pretty unreliable. If I ever want to use it for anything else, try and credit people, and their account is gone now or whatever, especially with what's happening with Twitter.
Yep.
Yeah, it's done. Yeah,
Oh,
that one's toast
it's
at this
sad.
point.
It's annoying too because somebody like you who has been able to build up this followership, and really be able to
Yeah,
connect with people. In a way, it sort of goes back to a question I didn't get to ask you, in that, it's almost, it feels like we're in
yeah,
the changing of formats again. Like
we
VHS is
are.
gone. DVD stores
Yeah,
are gone, those rentals. How are those images being shared now on Amazon Prime? What do you want to rent? What do you want to watch? Or, on Instagram, Twitter, like
yeah,
however people are marketing now. There's definitely a viral
yeah,
aspect to what you have done. I'm wondering, were
yeah.
video stores, VHS rental stores, DVD stores, the original like viral network of these ideas, of these images?
Yeah, I definitely feel like there's something to that because, especially when you're a little kid, it'll be like some kid on the playground or in the schoolyard will have seen a clip out of
Yeah.
context from some horror movie on TV that his dad was watching or something. And then it'll become almost like a kind of form of
Hmm.
urban legend in some ways because it'll get passed around and then it'll transcend being from some movie in the telling and just become like a schoolyard story or like something that someone purports actually happened. And then, 30 years will go by and you'll watch some movie on Netflix and have the PTSD
Right.
hit you all at once because you realize that thing from a million years ago was some like terrible movie from
Yeah.
1982 or whatever. So yeah, it can definitely get translated in that way. Like I know that Siren Head gets. I've had people tell me that their kids will be like talking to other kids on a playground at school somewhere and talk about Siren Head as if it's like a Bloody Mary or a boogeyman or something, an urban myth. And it's like I'm one person who made up a thing on social media, and it's really cool that it is gone that far and turned into something weird.
There's something magical about what you've been able to do, and the
Oh, I
amount of
know. Yeah.
children and fans who are going to grow up and probably create and make more, and
Oh yeah.
like that's an
Yeah.
incredible thing to be able to have done. Like the playground whisper networks of Siren Head and your other monsters is
Yeah.
that's special.
I fully agree, and I've said before that if anything comes from the weird popularity that those characters have enjoyed, if it's like kids making weird art and then growing up and making just continuing to make weirder art and like stuff that's going to be way cooler than anything I've ever done. But just being able to like maybe inspire a kid to do something like that is the coolest thing in the world. I can't even imagine it. Like the whole reason I mostly jumped on
Yeah.
doing the kids book, the Scarewaves for Scholastic, is because I remember how cool it was to find out the weird knockoff Goosebumps books at Scholastic book fairs, like Spine Tinglers and stuff, and being like obsessed with the art and like loving it. Like not only Goosebumps, but like all the weird ones that were kind of hitching a ride on the
Mhm.
Goosebumps train. And I was like, oh, can I do something like that? That's a modern equivalent that kind of like involves all the creepy
Yeah.
pastas and the urban myth kind of angle that
Yeah.
we enjoyed, but like is a throwback to Goosebumps, and some kid can find it on the shelf in a book fair somewhere, and it'll inspire him to write or draw or make up his own monster. Like that's
One
the
of the
coolest thing
best
in the world.
parts of being part of the Scholastic book fairs now, as an adult, as a writer, for me, is knowing that the
Yeah,
kids are able to reach for the book themselves and pick it out. They'll have the money in their pocket or credit of some kind from the school and be able to say, this is the one that I
yeah.
want. Mom and dad, aren't here. I'm picking out this one. And I know there's a lot of controversy in the country right now about mom and dad being involved in what you can and cannot read. That was what was cool about those book fairs. Let's get
Yes,
into
exactly.
Scarewaves a little bit. I mean, if you don't mind talking for a few more minutes.
Sure. Oh, of
Yeah,
course.
so
Yeah. No.
speaking of the urban legends or folklore in general, that's what Scarewaves, your new book, is it's all about. Can you, for the
Yeah.
readers, maybe give them a brief description of the plot?
Yeah. So Scarewaves is kind of my own version of kids versus monsters kind of plot that has been, in stuff like Summer of Night by Dan Simmons, like all these great books. I'm a huge fan of that kind of trope, and I want to do kind of my own spin on it. So it's about this small town called Beacon Point in the 90s. And the first part of the book is in a sort of pseudo anthology kind of thing, where each of these these kids from different walks of life. There's a girl who's a new kid in town. There's a kid who lives on a farm outside of town and is kind of a bit of an outcast. They each have their own encounters with these supernatural entities that have always been around in this town and hunt and eat kids. The kids that survive their encounters, about the midway point of the book, they find out it's happened to other people, and they kind of team up and then try and investigate it and try and get some evidence and see what can happen. But I just want to load as many monsters into the book as possible. So each kid has their own monster, and it's like a big monster mash.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the good way to describe it. It has a very unique format. And you sort of touched on that in saying the early part of the book sort of has an anthology feel to it. It felt like sort of a patchwork of pieces of stories and monster encounters. And you're intrigued to turn the pages to find out what you might next encounter and why and how these things are sort of come together. And the threads of the patchwork sort of become tighter and tighter as you get towards the end until it's all connected.
Yeah.
And it's a lot of fun. And I'm going to say it's like one of the scariest kids books that I've read this year as well.
Thank you.
The idea of the early part of the book sort of being patchwork, it sort of makes me think of what you've done online with your monster images. Do you feel like you were inspired to touch back on your past work in creating the book that way, or that just comes naturally to you?
No, absolutely. I wanted to do that. I wanted to definitely give the kind of thing, especially in the beginning, that I'm known for, and it's kind of inadvertently drummed up this fan base of kids, because I've never created specifically with kids in mind. When I'm doing monster stuff online, I'm just trying to make it interesting or scary, and the kind of thing that I think is scary and want to see. But it obviously has resonated with kids in a way that I think is really super cool. So I wanted to just kind of I didn't want to say oh, I'm writing for kids now. I'm writing for middle grade kids. I have to drum down the scares, or I have to make it less scary. I have to do this or that. Because Scholastic came to me specifically because kids resonate with the scary stuff that I did, not even thinking with them in mind. And I think kids appreciate that. I think kids can tell when you're, watering stuff down a little bit, when you're doing stuff with little kids in mind, and they appreciate it, that it's, at least I tried to make it as scary as anything I've ever done, but also have those kid characters there that they can, see themselves in, and that kind of relationship. And I think it's scarier if you have kids dealing with threats that aren't watered down, and they can see themselves in those kids and having to deal with the same sort of thing. I guess, if that makes any sense at all.
I was just at a book fest up in Maine, in Bath, Maine, called the Bath Book Bash, which is a wonderful spot. It's a good name. It's a really fun festival. It's Stephen King country, and so the little kids up there somewhat have a different kind of tolerance. There's a one boy who's 7 years old. I was talking to him about my books, trying to convince him to get one of them.
Yeah.
And he finally stopped me, and he was like, "Which book is the one where they don't make it out?" This was 7 years old. And I was like, well, Tales to Keep You Up at Night and More Tales to Keep You Up at Night have a whole bunch of people who don't make it out. And he was like, he just grabbed the books and was like, sign these, please. So it's incredible to me that there are kids out there who have that kind of need for scary stories, non-watered down stuff. It's kind of cool, but to sort of see the difference between kids who come up and say, hey, I want a mystery that's a little ghostly, but not too scary. And I can say, well, here, try this one. And then you have the kids like that. And I would definitely give Scarewaves to that kid.
I was a little worried that they would, Scholastic would have me kind of walk it back a little bit, because there are a lot of kids that don't make it to the end of the book in Scarewaves. So it's definitely for that first kid, not so much the ghostly mystery kid. I would have to write something else for that kid. But no, they let me do all that. So that's, I think that's awesome. They've actually, because I'm about to start on a follow-up, and one of the first calls was like, what if we, you should think about killing one of the kids. I'm like, okay,
Mhm.
all right, sure, okay. So they've been very understanding of that vibe, and that exact kid audience that you mentioned is very must be very vibrant and alive, because they're kids that can appreciate that bleakness of it. It's
It's
great.
also interesting, and I don't want to spoil the end of the book. I don't. Did you mention in your description of the book throughout that there are sort of interstitial periods
No,
where
I
there's a
completely
radio show that is hosted by Alan Graves?
yes.
Did you
Yes.
mention that, or okay.
I did not at all mention that. I was thinking that. So yeah, there's the main narrative that I mentioned earlier with the kids, kind of encountering these various monsters of all different shapes and sizes, and then having to team up to try and not be carried off and gotten by the monsters. But in between these chapters are transcripts of a radio show by a local radio host named Alan Graves, who kind of is like a modern. He's kind of like a combo between like the Crypt Keeper and like Art Bell, which is something that middle grade kids would not know at all about, but he's like a paranormal podcast guy, basically, who did shows on the radio. And I use that as a way to kind of give a little bit more explanation about where the tall tales that either sprung up from these monsters or were the origins of these monsters in different ways. And then it kind of all culminates, towards the end, where they realize that the radio show and the broadcast themselves might be kind of like a nexus for what's causing this. And I'm definitely going to go in, without spoiling too much, I definitely think I'm going to try and like tie up some loose ends towards that in the next book, because it is fairly ambiguous.
I love the ambiguity. I love what you did there.
You did? Okay. I'm so unsure about it, honestly, because I know it's from that.
Yeah.
Okay. Because I want to think that there are enough little seeds that you could maybe think sort of why there are monsters and what's going on, but it is very, very ambiguous, and I want to like explain a little bit more in the next one. And I have no idea if this ambiguity will work with middle grade kids, or if they'll be like, I don't know. So we'll see when it comes out, I guess.
Yeah.
But I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah,
That makes me really happy.
You'll find
Thank
out.
you.
They'll let you know. They will.
Yeah.
I
want to I'll definitely try and touch on some things that are not fully explained in the first book. I think
in my experience with having written a series where the first book ends very ambiguously, it makes the kids want to pick up the second book, and so if they know that there's another one coming, they will be, I don't want to say forgiving, because you don't have to be forgiven for ambiguity, but they will be anticipating and looking forward to maybe an answer or two. But I was going to ask you like what's next for you, but I mean if that's what you've got coming up, that's enough, and that sounds really exciting. Is there anything else you've any other projects you've got going on that you want to let everybody know about?
Yeah, I'm my bread and butter is really like freelance illustration work, a lot of comic variant covers and horror book covers, which I always love doing so much. But for bigger projects, it's definitely the second Beacon Point book, I guess is a way to refer to it. It doesn't have a title or anything yet. I'm just waiting to hear back on. I sent them a big synopsis of what I want to do with it. This one, if they approve it, the first one was very much like kind of like a Fear Street, like more supernatural, ghostly thing. And this one is going to be more like monster movie, like Tremors or Nope or something like that, if it gets approved. So I'm waiting to hear back from that, and then I'll be jumping into that if that's the case, if everything's okay. But besides that, we're gearing up for. I have a podcast that I'm the creative director on called Mayfair Watcher Society, which is a team of very talented writers making full episodes from some of the aforementioned creatures and photos and prompts.
It's a very impressive show. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, like I haven't as of yet written any episodes for myself. I really want to, but like the people they have on it, they're all incredible, and they all like absolutely get the exact vibe. And we're working on season 2 of that right now, which is going to be really, really cool, I think. And other than that, what else am I doing? Those are the 2 big projects right now, I think. But I hope to, moving forward into the new year, start to do some more like writing aside from the middle grade stuff, and some bigger, more ambitious projects, hopefully, if I can stop being so tired all the time.
You've been busy. It's been a big summer, and I so appreciate you finding the time to fit in this conversation with me. I'm a huge fan of yours, and
of course.
Scarewaves is going to bring even more acclaim to you. So I can't wait for people to experience it. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I'm really excited. Scarewaves comes out. It's almost here. I'm actually waiting on the final proofs
Oh my
to
gosh.
arrive at my door any day for the. I know it's in the mail, but the book comes out October 3rd,
It's
and you should be
also
able to get
filled
that.
with your illustrations.
Yes, it has. I did the cover, and it has 28 black and white illustrations throughout. There was an early copy that only had 5, but there's 28 full ones. It comes out October 3rd, and if you read it, I hope you like it.
Yeah, I'm sure they will. Well, listen, Trevor, thank you so much. This has been a blast.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me on. This has been great and just really lovely talking to you.
Thank you all for listening, and a special thanks again to Trevor Henderson. I hope you're inspired to look up his work, and even possibly to use it as a jumping off point for some stories of your own. I love a good writing prompt, and his creature illustrations are perfect for that, especially at this time of year. In listening back to our talk, I've reflected a bit on the moment when I question why the 1980s were obsessed with body horror, and melting bodies specifically. And while I do think it warrants a much longer conversation, I feel like the obvious answer, which has since occurred to me in a head-smacking realization, is that the world was dealing with the beginnings of the HIV/AIDS pandemic, the tragedy of which would eventually make headlines and front pages all around the world, causing over 40 million deaths, and creating a wave of fear and unfair stigma that still echo to this day. Fascinating how sometimes the answer is staring us right in the face, like the Stephen Gamble illustration of the eyeless girl that chilled a young Trevor Henderson to the bone. And like I said, it's all worth a much longer conversation. Someday. Please subscribe to Our First Fears wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you'd like, you can follow our social media, Our First Fears, one word, on the site formerly known as Twitter, as well as on Instagram. If you do want to get in touch, let me know. What's your favorite horror film face-melting scene? Mine must be a tie between Raiders of the Lost Ark and Poltergeist. Thanks again for your precious time. I'm Dan Poblocki, wishing you sweet dreams and pleasant nightmares.